Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. What a pleasure to join you in this live stream on this YouTube channel, The Mendicant Philosopher. A live stream, this time entitled Traditionalism and Progressivism Within the Church. So, this is an incredibly interesting topic, thinking about, especially in Catholicism and the Catholic Church, but certainly we notice these ideological patterns and trends within non-Catholic Christian denominations or Eastern Orthodoxy. So I'm concentrating especially on Christianity here in this live stream, though these patterns and trends in ideology also can be observed in non-Christian religions also around the world. And our task is to understand ideology best and to think about how it works within society, within the church, especially moving to how ideology operates within the church. So I want to pick up where I left off and thinking about ideology and how in ideology, humanity, we could say, is disincarnate into the machine. There's a depersonalization that happens in ideology and a kind of technocratic phenomenon where it's a movement from free individual persons living in community to this automatized kind of existence into the groupthink, into the crowd mentality, the mob mentality, and where there becomes an anonymity of individuals. And we see this as a phenomenon happening in the worst cases in various terrorist kind of groups and movements where the perpetrators wear masks and hide their faces. And so at its extreme, ideology becomes violent, physically, very destructive, and typically ideology will breed violence, beginning with speech, beginning with words, beginning with body language. So we see this in all kinds of political rhetoric. It's a violent kind of discourse. It's not really trying to dialogue openly, honestly, and to get at the truth in a collective way. But what's happening instead is words become like verbal missiles, and they're launched at the ideological other back and forth. And we call it mudslinging. There's a lot of mudslinging, and there's communication breakdown, and it gets very emotional. And when we can no longer actually communicate through speech, through dialogue, it will turn to violent acts. Violent acts, both symbolic and purely practical, to destroy the other who remains a threat to my own ideology. Um, so we keep this in mind as we think about how ideology, humanity is disincarnate into the machine. And the machine can perform practical tasks more efficiently, more expediently, and more impersonally than man. Relating the terror of the guillotine in late 18th century France, Gertrude van der Voort, in her book, Song at the Scaffold, writes, "Ah, my friend, a machine cannot discriminate. It is not responsible. It shudders at nothing. It destroys indifferently everything that is brought to it, the noble and the pure, as well as the most criminal. Truly, the machine is a worthy tool of chaos. Perhaps it is the very crown of chaos, a crown worn by the enthusiasm of the soulless mob that knows no divine creation, but only satanic destruction." End quote from Gertrude van der Voort's Song at the Scaffold, thinking about what happened in the French Revolution, in which the loftiest ideals of humanity, such as liberty and fraternity, became a caricature and were transformed into the direct opposite of themselves. And ideology, we see here, leads to the anonymity of chaos. Again, as Lefort says, chaos, a terrible parody on the equality of all. In chaos, none preserves even his own face. In ideology, the impulsiveness of ideas is translated into the expulsiveness of the machine. It is clear that ideology functions apart from face and name, taking place in a context which is colored by values and collective unconscious volitional impulses. So, this is why ideology is very dangerous for human beings in every way, and it's very much an enemy to philosophy. Philosophy, we cannot think clearly if we have an ideological takeover of the thought process, a kind of ideological hijacking of this free, comprehensive thinking toward the whole. Ideology will straitjacket the whole into one or some of its many parts and confuse those parts for the whole. Our inevitable interaction with ideology, or at least with the temptation to ideology, is a sort of playing field, therefore, between virtue and vice. Virtuous thought is that which overcomes the facile reductionism to a few choice parts of the whole by binding thought to the saturating self revelation of the whole that its witness is never able to master, manipulate, or dominate. What appears most menacing within the evolution of culture today is the replacement of metaphysics, classical metaphysics, that perennial thinking toward the whole, a replacement of metaphysics with pragmatism, that novel thinking toward the parts. Pragmatism is not itself an ideology, but rather the philosophical foundation of ideology. And this is very popular in the United States as a nation. One of the greatest strengths of the nation in terms of practical achievement is also one of its greatest weaknesses. Pragmatism, the elevation of pragmatism, the elevation of the act over the thought, of the product over the person, of the pioneering over the personalism. And so pragmatism can move us to an idolatry of productivity, an idolatry of invention, an idolatry of money, an idolatry of achieving our own goals. All these various kinds of idolatries rooted in pragmatism. Is it possible for us to undo this usurpation of metaphysics by pragmatism today? Can this juxtaposition of competing philosophical foundations itself escape ideological suspicion? So we're moving toward talking about ideology within the church as the ideology of the left, progressivism, we could say, and the ideology of the right, traditionalism. We're going to talk about these two distinct ideologies within the church, and we are getting a running start into that by thinking of ideology in general terms and moving toward how we see it in these two specific forms in the church. But we have to see that all ideologies are rooted in pragmatism, this obsessive passion with achieving practical goals. And this is where rational deliberation and investigation and philosophy gets supplanted by this obsessive, passionate pursuit of practical goals. Pragmatism is the root of ideology inasmuch as the chief motive behind ideologies is not really to search for truth, but to achieve definite goals. As a purely pragmatic worldview, ideology is the conversion of ideas into social levers, the commitment to the consequences of ideas. So, ideas becoming a means to an end, contemplative ideas becoming a means to a practical end, ideas converted into levers. I'm going to pull this lever by using this term, by entering into this discourse, by entering into this Wittgensteinian language games in which it's a kind of nominalism where the human subject is determining reality by the language being used. and it's a nominalism and a sophism, that we're going to use our language to shape reality, even in a purely imaginative way, that we convince ourselves and our listeners that this is what reality is, based on the consistent tropes being employed within the political ideological discourse: nominalism, sophism, political rhetoric, violent discourse. We are going to create reality as we speak it into being, as finite human subjects. This is how ideology functions. It's very elusive, it's very confusing, because if any of us can invent reality based on our language, based on consistent ways of speaking and no other ones, um, we're not on the same page metaphysically. Truth becomes also something that is factitious, something that the human subjects are making up as they go. And no longer do we have a metaphysical realism, a common bearing on reality based on its givenness to us, but instead an ideology, we make it what we want to be. So it's more of a it involves this hypothetical ideation and factitious thinking and speaking and writing, and propagandizing, to craft reality as we would like it to be, according to our um, uh, a priori self interests that we have in life. And so, it's a purely pragmatic worldview. Ideology converts ideas into social levers, wherein ideas become weapons. A weaponization of thought is what happens in ideology. And philosophy detests this. True philosophy, doesn't want power, doesn't want fame, doesn't want all the money in the world, doesn't want pleasure, except certain brands of truncated philosophy, like a kind of Epicureanism or hedonism or something. But philosophy wants the purity of the real. Philosophy wants the whole. Philosophy wants the truth. And yes, we will become, as philosophers, the begging fools of society. But we have our treasure, and it is the truth, it is the whole. It is something that money can't buy, but only can try to manipulate. This is what we want in philosophy, and moreover, in theology. So, conceding that pragmatism is the taproot of all ideology, for the ideologue, truth arises in action, and meaning is given to experience by the transforming moment, in which the ideologue comes alive not in contemplation, but in deed. As absolute pragmatism, ideology is forgetful and even hostile to detached political theory in favor of self interested, practical political persuasion. The power of pragmatism and the exigencies of praxis arouse an unquenchable emotional current in ideology's practitioners. What gives ideology its force is its passion. One might say, in fact, the most important latent function of ideology is to tap emotion. And Daniel Bell recognizes this in his book, The End of Ideology, on the exhaustion of political ideas in the 50s, published by Harvard University Press in 2001. But again, for the origin of the term ideology, it goes back to the French philosopher de Stoute-Troissy in his 1801 book, Elements d'Idéologie. elements of ideology. And with Deschutes de Troissy's revision of Cartesian epistemology, we get not cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, but sentio ergo sum, I feel, therefore I am. For Deschutes de Troissy, all ideas have a genealogy traceable to sensory experience. It's almost like, for Troissy, at least in this descriptive kind of philosophy, that we begin with sense data as the formal causality of action that is also tethered on the front end to the final causality of practical achievement. From sense to achievement of practical goals, ideology runs between the two. We could say, in a real sense, ideology thinks with its emotions, thinks with its feelings. And really, for philosophy, then, we're not thinking. We are being possessed by our affectivity, our emotion, our feelings, our senses. And the senses give rise to passion, and they start to aim at practical goals. And this is how ideology moves from sense to practical achievement. It is its affective effectiveness, therefore, that exposes the wiliness of ideology and its imperium to hijack even religion to cooperate in the accomplishment of its passionate purposes. And this makes sense because, as Paul Tillich says, our faith, our religious faith, involves what we hold to be of ultimate concern as human beings. What we hold to be of ultimate concern means we're very passionate about that thing, about those values, the religious ones. Even the word religion, from the Latin religare, where we get the English word ligaments, to bind together and to rebind, to reinforce a binding. I'm bound to what I hold to be of ultimate concern, ultimate value, ultimate importance in life, in my religious belief. And everyone has one. Even atheism has religion. It has a sense of ultimate concern about life, about meaning, about purpose, why to live rather than to die. So nobody can get away from religion. And what we mean by this philosophically, the human being is the religious being above all. But ideology will co-opt religion in order to have its way with people, depersonalized persons. And ideology sees religion as a vehicle for accomplishing its practical goals. So we have a hijacking of philosophy, a hijacking of theology, religious belief and practice with ideology. Yes, it's that viral. It gets into the cells of thought and inserts its own program. Ideology is viral. This is why it's popular. This is why it's trending. This is why it's fashionable. This is why it is profitable. If I wanted to become a millionaire, I would become an ideologue. And I could achieve it in due time. And I found this out years ago, even in how one invests money. I could invest in certain things that I know very well are not good for humanity, and I can make a whole lot of money from them. The logic of ideology is destructive. The logic of vice is destructive. And there's multi-billion-dollar industries that bank on the destruction of their consumers. What an irony. So ideology operates in the same kind of fashion, in a viral way, that it is going to hijack the lifeblood of the human subject, introduce its own program, and thereby destroy the human subject in the process. And it will also usurp things religious to accomplish its passionate goals. Even though I myself I may sound like I'm speaking as if I have no ideology, but I'm just pointing to other people that do. As if I have no self-interest, but I'm just pointing to all these people who do. No, I want to come clean even for myself in the thought process. And to do so, I must enter a confessional discourse. I must expose myself also and everything in me to the light of day. So even though I would certify that Jesus, the Christ, and his church, for me, is the very meeting place of fact and value. I love that expression. The very meeting place of fact and value, and I would confess, is Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ, Jesus and the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. For me, yes, I would certify that Jesus for me is the center of the universe and the center of history. So I say this, but I cannot help at the same time but blush before the accusation that my Christ is at once my own ideological idol and halo. How am I to renounce the near occasion of ideological idolatry, especially when I suspect that my own divine object of worship is a reification of my disguised predilection for innocent self affection? This is something to think about, and perhaps here again. So, in a way of passing confession, what I'm saying is I want to come clean with my own self interests and to call myself into question, is my worship only certifying my neediness for affirmation, for self affection? And yes, that's part of things. It's not necessarily evil. Who doesn't want to be loved? And the desire to be loved is not evil. The desire to want to belong, to be affirmed, is not evil. It's a genuine human desire. We would say this is a good thing. It's good to want to be loved, to want to be cared for, to want to be noticed, to want to be accepted, to want to belong, to want to be part of a family of faith in the case of the church. But I say all this to make sure that my own religious belief and practice is not driven by ideology. There is not a Trojan ideological program lurking in my own religious belief and practice. And the way I can ensure this is to consciously, actively, verbally, explicitly disown any ideological program in advance and on the way. And what we mean by this is the ideology of the left and the ideology of the right, generally speaking, that I'm not going to say I belong to one or the other, as if that is my primary identity marker, as if that's my primary community of belonging, as if that drives all of my practical activity in my life. No, I'm going to renounce the near occasion of ideology in both directions equally to the same degree. I'm going to renounce both, perhaps and possibly necessarily by, in some ways, embracing both as the whole of humanity, the whole of thinking, as yes, all of the practical goals under the sun in relation to justice, in relation to the common good. I want to embrace it all. Is it possible to renounce both the ideology of the right and the ideology of the left, rendering oneself homeless and without ideological belonging in the ever-present ideological wars of the world that even creep into the church? In order to grant amnesty to the would-be guilty conscience strong-armed by ideological influence in a religious caste, it is necessary to expose the two primary ecclesial ideologies, namely traditionalism, from the ideology of the right, and progressivism from the ideology of the left. So what we're going to do is take stock then of these various political ideologies. We're going to take stock of them, beginning with traditionalism and then moving to progressivism. We're going to unpack them and consider their distinctive features. So beginning with traditionalism, every ideology seeks not only to be in the right, at least to appear to be in the right. Again, ideology seeks not to be right, not to be correct, not to be exact, accurate, truthful. Ideology rather seeks to appear to be in the right before people. Just like a good lawyer, an effective lawyer in the courtroom, uh, in a sophistic way, sophism of the lawyer, he or she doesn't necessarily care if what he or she is arguing is right, is the truth, but wants to persuade the jury or the judge, the jury, that the evidence points in favor of the guilt or the non-guilt of the party in question. And this is a technique. It's a technique because it involves the techne of ideas, the factitiousness of thought. There's technique about ideology. So every ideology seeks not only to appear to be in the right, but also to demolish the basis of its opponent's social and intellectual existence. Nietzsche writes in Twilight of the Idols, or How to Philosophize with a Hammer, quote, "Another triumph is our spiritualization of hostility. It consists in the fact that we are beginning to realize very profoundly the value of having enemies. In short, that with them we are forced to do and to conclude precisely the reverse of what we previously did and concluded. In all ages, the church wished to annihilate its enemies. We, the immoralists and antichrists," Nietzsche says, "see our advantage in the survival of the church. Even in political life, hostility has now become more spiritual, much more cautious, much more thoughtful, and much more moderate. Almost every party sees its self-preservative interests in preventing the opposition from going to pieces. And the same applies to politics on a grand scale. A new creation, more particularly, like the new empire, has more need of enemies than friends. Only as a contrast does it begin to feel necessary. Only as a contrast does it become necessary," end quote. So this is in the section of Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols entitled Morality as the Enemy of Nature. And so I'm using the work of Nietzsche in a sense to turn Nietzsche against Nietzsche in this phenomenology of ideology, is what I'm up to in these live streams, in this article that's about to be published in a couple weeks, that I've entitled Twilight of the Idols of Ideology. So to think along with Nietzsche here, he's saying that essentially in ideology, it's necessary to have an enemy. And the enemy itself justifies the reinforcement of the ideological point of view. If there's no opposition, there's no enemy, there's no ideological other. In essence, there's no need for ideology. When we take leave of this competitive framework of being, there's no more need for ideology. There's no more opponent to defeat. But we see at the root of the ideological circuit and the perennial ideological contests is a competitive hermeneutics of being, rooted again in the Spinozan conatus essendi, the struggle to persevere in my ownmost being, that is connected to all my self-interests, which are self-evident to the self, and the fear acting as a penumbra around the self-interests to preserve them, protect them, and persevere in them. So, self-interest, fear, ideological program, ideological belonging, ideological hermeneutics of being in which I always have an enemy before me. And it's not the devil. It's not demons. It's not even evil. The enemy is the competing self-interests that are not identical to my own. And this is where, yes, indeed, Satan, the demons have a heyday, because they are no longer perceived as the enemy, but rather the accomplice in ideology achieving its goals. Ideology does better with Satan than without Satan, because Satan is casting the diabolical shadow precisely in and through ideology. When ideology itself programs our self-understanding of existence to be one of competing with a human other, a creature like myself, who I face in order to destroy, the kingdom of destruction has had its way. And we see this operative across human history. We wonder what's going on with this empire, with this kingdom, with this dictatorship, with this certain very intensified political program, whether capitalist or communist. What's going on? Ideology is having its way. We might also, what's going on in the church? Why within Christianity do we have a kind of internecine competition within the family itself, the family of God, the people of God? Why do we feel like we need to take a side on this side of the aisle or that side of the aisle of the church, and not only the Capitol building? Why are the colors red and blue bleeding into the church, as if you have to be one or the other? So we want to unmask all of this in order to overcome it through the love of God that is given through Jesus of Nazareth once again. So let us consider again traditionalism. Through a perfunctory demonizing of the opposite ideological enemy, by enlisting a litany of derogatory and defamatory epithets in reference to the alien ideological other, the traditionalist or conservative position thinks within its self-defined echo chamber, only according to the sort of knowledge giving practical control. And I've encountered many ideological interlocutors over the years, and I would describe this phenomenologically, what's going on with the self-referential echo chamber that listens with its own mouth, according to a kind of knowledge that only gives practical control in a situation. It's not a genuine knowledge to be shared among dialogue partners, but it's a knowledge for the sake of practical control of a situation, control of the power dynamics within the social situation. So the discourse, the symbolisms, the way of speaking, the references being used and not used, determines an attempt at a practical control of a social situation. And you even see this in academia between students and professors. It could go both ways. I've been on the side as a professor in a classroom where students are trying to gain a social control of the situation by adopting ideological points of view. whether traditional or progressive, whether the ideology of the right or the ideology of the left. And it can function either way. But when I'm in a classroom, when I'm in a university setting or a seminary setting, I'm professing, I'm attesting to the whole. That's my role as a faithful professor to truth that is the whole, and that doesn't cash out in one ideological configuration or another. So it's a very difficult situation in teaching and learning when you have a student who is ideologically programmed and they don't want to dialogue. They don't come to learn. It's like they didn't come to earn a degree, but to give one out as the student. And it's very difficult in the environment of teaching and learning when this happens. So I would say ideology itself is a great obstacle to the liberal arts tradition of open investigation, of teaching and learning. Why is there tenure at universities? At least some. It's going extinct, practically speaking, because of ideology, because of trading of truth for power. But the idea of tenure was that you have a seasoned professor who has proven him or herself in his or her work and experience and teaching, and has earned this tenure contract so that ideology cannot push him or her out of the free pursuit of knowledge of truth. But now we have a manipulation of the process of tenure itself. And this is a very sad thing in academia. It's being compromised, it's being amputated. The humanities, things like tenure, are being amputated by the forces of ideology and practical concerns of matter and money. So, um, lacking any notion of utopia, coming back to traditionalism lacks any notion of utopia in the future because it's found in the past and it's found in the present. The traditionalist is trying to preserve what is already the case for him or her and his or her tribe, family, people, perhaps race, hegemonic situation. They're trying to reinforce what is already the case, what has already arrived in terms of the manifest destiny, and they don't want it to change. They resist change. They want to keep things the way they are, as well as retrieve this golden era of the past to reinforce a very comfortable and complacent social situation. Again, if my analysis is more on the social behavioral science side of things, that's intentional because ideology itself involves a sociology of knowledge. And so we have to pry underneath it through a kind of sociological approach. So traditionalism lacks any notion of utopia like the progressives have in terms of a utopia to realize into the future, because the conservative mentality has no predisposition toward theorizing, since it is in its very structure completely in harmony with reality, which for the time being it has mastered. Traditionalists tend not to be self-aware or globally aware, failing to realize that the universe is actually much more saturating and expansive than they can wrap their minds around all at once. So don't worry, I'm talking about traditionalism and I'm critiquing traditionalism here, but I will go on to critique progressivism just as fiercely. Traditionalists claim to have a monopoly on the living tradition of the church, all the while reducing the dynamism of tradition and the organic development of doctrine in favor of a static notion of tradition as something frozen once and for all in a romanticized past, a golden time at which everything was the way it should be. And yet it is precisely this idealized an absolutized past that has become the present reality that they have mastered. Again, they gained control over the present reality. They gained practical control over it through the traditionalist ideology. By proceeding to label some particular limited viewpoints, their own, as suprapartisan and authoritative, landing in a certain definition of the situation, on guard against any kikenshiso, dangerous thoughts that would upset its status quo anti-prerogative of privilege for the way things used to be and remain. So it is not men in general who think here, or even isolated individuals who do the thinking, but men in certain groups who have developed a particular style of thought in an endless series of responses to certain typical situations, characterizing their common position based on common self-interest. The traditionalist ideologue lacks necessary self-awareness of his own deficiencies and blind spots, largely due to the unconscious collective motivations which always guide the direction of ideological thought. To quote Francis Bacon, human understanding has the tendency to deny evidence that proves its current understanding to be in error, rather than sacrifice the authority of its first conclusion. For man always believes more readily that which he prefers. End quote. Isn't that interesting about us human beings? We believe more readily that which we prefer. And in research, we call this going and finding sources that only confirm your argument you've already concluded. And the internet is perfect for this. Everyone has a PhD now because of the internet. And I don't mean to disparage the honest, open pursuit of truth, but in theology or philosophy, there's a kind of joke that everyone has a PhD in philosophy and theology, because everyone can find their own resources to reinforce what they already think. And that's what's called an echo chamber. And the internet serves that sociology of knowledge quite well. We can do searches and click on the preferred links rather than the ones that would contradict our current position. But if we want to know the truth, we must, like Thomas Aquinas, strong arm this argument with which we are unfamiliar, in order to familiarize ourselves better with the truth as the whole. Thomas Aquinas, the way he writes, the way he thought, did this, beginning with objectives to his own position that he would argue in the end. But he entertains the objectives as if they're his own arguments to begin with. And he's willing to make them his own arguments if he was actually convinced that they were the case. But he knows he's not convinced because he's explored them thoroughly. And this is why Thomas Aquinas is a great emblematic philosopher and theologian for us today, because he considered all sides of a question, all sources that inform it. And he arrived at a final conclusion, which oftentimes was rather dialectical, always dialogical. Understanding truth as the whole. So we need to admit that we believe more readily that which we prefer. And we're talking about traditionalism and how it does this very well. Progressivism in its own way does this. Again, extremes meet within ideology, but we're thinking about the traditionalists first, and how they tend to conflate objective orthodoxy with subjective preferences. I've seen this many times, especially in the domain of liturgy, falling prey to unwarranted dogmatisms and sectarian viewpoints. Again, ideology prefers to appear to be in the right than to be right. And not only does each of the conflicting factions of ideology have its own set of interests and purposes, but each has its own picture of the world in which the same objects are accorded quite different meanings and values. The absence of a common apperception mass vitiates the possibility of appealing to the same criteria of relevance and truth. And since the world is held together to a large extent by words, when these words have ceased to mean the same thing to those who use them, it follows that people will of necessity misunderstand and talk past one another. This is what happens in ideology, talking past one another, because the words we're using don't even mean the same thing anymore. Again, we use the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein to get into the language games of discourse and how they function. So, any given issue, we have to examine the language games at work and to unmask and deconstruct the ideological strongholds of grammar, of language, of rhetoric, in order to resume the same page of discourse and use the same words to mean the same thing so we can have an actual conversation. But when this is not happening, when there is a talking past each other rhetorically, this depressing state of affairs is aggravated by the fact that the intellectual world is not free from the struggle for personal distinction and power. This has led to the introduction of the wiles of salesmanship into the realm of ideas, into the academy, and has brought about a condition where even scientists would rather be in the right than right. They'd rather appear to be in the right than actually right with what they are talking about, with what they're investigating. And so for philosophy, this is not acceptable. We want to be right. We want to be exact, precise. We want to be accurate in our thought process, in our investigation, in our language, which we don't let become a nominalism. The philosopher is not the one who invents reality, but who receives it. And this is why the methods like phenomenology and metaphysics in philosophy are essential for us today. These bookends of new and old, of philosophizing, where we take the real seriously. With Edmund Husserl, we want to call a thing what it is. We want to return to the things themselves. We don't want to hijack reality according to our grammars of self-interest. No, the more disinterested, the better. In philosophy, in science, in theology, the more disinterested, the better. And this is why I would suggest the experience of persecution itself verifies the veracity of the so called knowledge of truth, because one is persecuted through the perseverance of the testimony of the witness. And this we see in who we call the martyrs of faith, the ones who were put to death because they renounced the renunciation of falsehood. So, thinking again together about, still thinking about traditionalism, moving toward progressivism before this live stream ends. So we can say the ecclesial ideology of the right runs with a hermeneutic of suspicion vis-a-vis the ecclesial ideology of the left. Conspiracy theories abound as a means to scapegoat the progressives, the ideological other of the ideological right, as the cause of all ecclesial ills and imbalances. The distrust and suspicion which people everywhere evidence towards their adversaries at all stages of historical development may be regarded as the immediate precursor of the notion of ideology. It is only when we more or less consciously seek to discover the source of their untruthfulness in a social factor that we are properly making an ideological interpretation. The particular conception of ideology therefore signifies a phenomenon intermediate between simple lie at one pole and an error, which is the result of a distorted and faulty conceptual apparatus at the other. This profound disintegration of intellectual unity is possible only when the basic values of the contending groups are worlds apart. And this is the case with ideology. The basic values of the contending groups of the right and the left are worlds apart. And so then we get a culture of distrust and suspicion and competition. And Rene Girard's scapegoat phenomenon enters here, where the ideological other will be scapegoated for every social problem. It's his fault, it's her fault, it's their fault. And this is the political rhetoric, the violent political discourse. To solve all the problems, we have to eliminate that ideological other, and then we will achieve paradise. For the traditionalist, we will achieve the paradise of the past. For the progressive, we will achieve the utopia of the future, which the proletariat brings about by force. And the traditionalist has his own force to the same degree. Um, so, for example, now this gets more specific here, talking about ideology in the church. During the pontificate of Pope Francis and the Catholic Church, traditionalists have attempted to put the teaching and governing authority of the church in competition with itself. Council of Trent versus Second Vatican Council, Pope St. Pius X versus Pope Francis, the extraordinary form of the Latin liturgical rite versus the post-conciliar ordinary form of the Latin liturgical rite. St. Thomas Aquinas against every theologian who has written since the year 1274 and has not merely aped the angelic doctor, and so on. This pitting of one council against another, or one magisterial document against another, or one pope against another, only serves to undermine the authority to which the traditionalist argument incompletely appeals. Even more shocking is when the traditionalist acts as if he knows better than the ecumenical council, knows better than the pope, and seems to pick and choose those magisterial texts that are authoritative and those that are not. This phenomenon points to the pretentious authoritative autonomy of the ideology over and against the unified, cohesive, and infallible magisterial reality and authority of the church. Traditionalist attitudes that desire to co-opt Thomas Aquinas, for example, as their chief representative theologian, as if he exemplifies monolithic and homogeneous thinking, sadly have not read enough of his actual work to know that he is paradigmatic of Catholic theology, precisely because his thought is dialogical and cosmopolitan, serving well the global exigencies of fidelity to truth as the whole. This is to say that St. Thomas Aquinas' thinking is dialogical and cosmopolitan. It's global, precisely because it is in dialogue with the world. It is what is demanded of truth. What is most true to truth is a thought process that remains in dialogue with every interlocutor found along the way. We need only recall several of St. Thomas' non-Christian interlocutors that bear witness to his Catholic genius. The Jewish Moses Maimonides, the Muslim Avicenna, Averroes, and the Greek pagan Aristotle, who he called the philosopher. Traditionalism, precisely as an ideology of the right, undermines the very notion of Catholicism, that perennial thinking toward the whole through faith and reason. By betraying, traditionalism betrays the living tradition of the church and the polyphony of theological traditions within the tradition, as well as turns its back on the unwavering commitment to the sincerity of living conversation, ongoing conversation, synodal conversation as the necessary condition of possibility for encountering truth. So this is a critique of traditionalism in the church. And now I move to the critique of progressivism. And I want to treat this completely even-handedly. And because that's my point, is neither nor, because both and. Truth as the whole. Having uncloaked several of the defining features of traditionalism, let us consider next the ecclesial ideology of the left, namely progressivism. Progressivism involves a reductionism, opposite that of the traditionalists, that we are able to reduce all religious concepts and categories to sociological, anthropological, psychological, political, or cultural ones, thus the recurring error of intersectionality, as if all hermeneutics could be reduced to socio-political axes and analyses. And so as you noticed how I critiqued traditionalism, I used some of that intersectionality to do so without trying to turn the truth into a purely social behavioral science discourse. But I did use some of the tools of social behavioral science to unmask what's going on in the ideology of the right. As Karl Mannheim puts it in his book Ideology and Utopia, progressives, if they are not at once Marxists, which they usually are, have a particular utopian vision in mind in which certain oppressed groups are intellectually so strongly interested in the destruction and transformation of a given condition of society that they unwittingly see only those elements in the situation which tend to negate it. When it comes to ecclesiology, progressives tend to aim most of their darts at things like clericalism, institutionalism, biblical and doctrinal fundamentalism, moralism, and above all, traditionalism. They are interested in acting as agents of change to overturn oppressive power structures, economic disparities, and infractions against common human rights. They fixate on the new while renouncing the old, typically. They envision a church that is so open and inclusive to new ideas that perennial philosophy of metaphysics and the stability of doctrine are relativized to the point of evanescence and non recognition. So, doctrine becomes very fluid in the progressive mindset. According to an ideology of relativism as part of the ideology of the left. Because they identify unity as uniformity, the very mistake made by the traditionalists as well. So here we see extremes meet in ideology. Progressives champion a disunified diversity that amounts to a fragmented collective of divisive factions. It's almost as if the value of an idea is determined by its uniqueness, its distinctiveness, its otherness. Otherness that is regarded as such an ideological absolute that there's no points of contact to form a unity. So here we have in the progressive ideology, we could say being content with fragmentation as normative in a sense. Again, this corresponds on the ideology of the right with a kind of individualism as normative, which is a kind of fragmentation too. So it's not that only the ideology of the left results in fragmentation, but we can describe it in these terms. And the more extreme it gets, the more it will come around and meet the extremity of the ideology of the right. So progressives are interested in renouncing the old, envisioning a church that is so open and inclusive to new ideas that the stability of doctrine becomes unstabilized. Because progressives identify unity as uniformity, we get this fragmentation. Rooted in class struggle and the revolt of the repressed, progressivism champions the cause of the vanguard of the proletariat by making it an ideological absolute. Progressivism fires all of its ammo at hegemonic structures of power of the current establishment that privilege the social status of the aristocracy and bourgeoisie, whether in the hierarchical church or in the stratified polis. The contextual narratives of marginalized groups become the gospel, with Jesus as their human spokesperson. A very low Christology will obtain with the ideology of the left, a very high Christology would obtain the ideology of the right. In progressivism, every meaningful idea becomes a new political campaign, lobbying public opinion in the direction of collective action that disenthrones the dominant and prestigious elite who never could withstand the tide of the manic masses of people become machine or the violent and mechanical mob mentality. Progressivism is sustained by the utopian vision of the equality of diversity becomes sameness. This is again where extremes meet. While the ideology of the left privileges diversity in its political program as Marxism, as achieving the utopia, diversity vanishes. Everyone looks the same, talks the same, does the same activity. Everything is equalized by force, and so there's no freedom, there's no free agency, there's no entrepreneurship. Uh, Everything is forced into a state of sameness. And this is getting to what the ideology of the right has prized all along, the homogeneity of the tribe. But here in the ideology of the left, we have the uh, person become anonymous, faceless, where you can't tell the difference between one and the other. So extremes meet. Progressivism is sustained by this utopian vision. Ecclesiologically, clericalism is opposed by laicism and a gradual process of declericalization, which we've seen historically in Protestant Christianity. In the radical reform of the Anabaptists and beyond, the phenomenon we have today called non-denominational or interdenominational, we have a denomination in the form of the negative, in which there are virtually no visible sacraments, no priesthood, no institutional organization of the religious community, but it becomes such low church that it's hard to distinguish between the secular polis and the church. Declericalization, a desacralization, desacramentalization of the church. We've already seen with Protestant Christianity, again at the extremities of the Protestant Reform. The result is already evident, yes, in the radical reform movements of Protestantism, in which this process of desacralization has achieved its goal, again, by the power of the prophetic word, the power of the charismatic proclamation, which is looking to shatter all of the idols in its path, but the kernels start to get thrown out with the husk. And so we have not only shattering the idols, but an evaporation of the sacred. And then we end up with a very secular church that could set up shop in a shopping mall, that could just one make one's own church however one wants. And this is what has happened historically. This process of desacralization achieving its goal in the secular ecclesia that has been called out of the sacred to worship the profane. Even as Max Weber, in his sociologist in his work, talks about the Protestant work ethic, we see a conflation of material productivity and gain and spiritual productivity and gain, where what's been called the prosperity gospel, where God blesses me with all of these material goods, which are the prized values of secularism. And as if that's the point, as if I worship God in order to get the bigger paycheck, as if I worship God to get all of the material things my heart desires. And we see God becoming a means to a secular end in this extreme um, sociologized ecclesiology, opposed to the Puritan traditionalist obsession of demarcating between the sacred and the secular in order to hallow the hegemony, which happens in traditionalism. Progressivism, for its part, secularizes the sacred in order to baptize brokenness, only to normalize fragmentation and depersonalism. So this is a critique of progressivism, following the critique of traditionalism. So in these two passing depictions of traditionalism on one hand and progressivism on the other, the elephant in the room has been named and undoubtedly upset. Yet this intentional vocal disturbance of mute collective unconscious disturbance might be the only hope of awakening the dogmatic slumber of ideology, no matter its currency or stripe. It is the hope of this argument that somehow the disturbance of disturbance could secure the movement to genuine dialectical peace, dialogical peace, through the reduction of reductionism in favor of the whole as the unified plurality of being. Return to metaphysics. In the disoriented orientation of ideology, extremes meet, as we have seen, if only beginning our description of this phenomenon. The secularization of the sacred can be witnessed in both the far right and in the far left, just as the homogenization of difference can be witnessed in both the right, the far right, and in the far left. One can then observe the banality of the manifest destiny replayed in every athletic contest, shopping spree, and social revolution. For examples, the banality of the manifest destiny that has to do with winning rather than losing, buying rather than selling or sharing, and revolting rather than working in peaceful unity toward the common good. Where the transcendence of God goes absent, the hyperimmanence of the secular becomes pedantic, even in so-called sacred spaces of worship. This experience of blasé, pedantic existence, a kind of tediousness of the practical rendered absolute. Ultimately, the essence of ecclesial ideology is the phenomenon of conflating one's ecclesiological outlook with an earthbound secular hermeneutic of the ideology of the right or the ideology of the left, traditionalism or progressivism. In either case, God has nothing left to do among us, since we have assigned all tasks to ourselves alone. The idols of ideology are many and varied. The idols of ideology are many and varied, but at some point their faces all look the same. Ideological extremes meet when the other than the self is obliterated. Is not ecclesial ideology overcome to the degree that we refuse to take a side, and at the same time promote conversation between different and even opposing points of view? Okay, so to this end, thank you for the chat. How do I feel about Walter J. Weiss of SDA, how he warns of Catholicism as the Antichrist? It's a contradiction of terms. Catholicism is the fullness of Christ, and that would be a greatest illusion of the devil who masquerades as an angel of light to make people believe that the fullness of Christ is precisely the Antichrist. And if one studies enough the church and lives in the church and breathes the fresh air of the sacramental life of the church, we know very well the church is not the Antichrist. But it can be a tool of ideology if we let it. Now that becomes the Antichrist. So we have to distinguish the ideological hijacking of things in the church, never the full church, but of some persons in the church, leaders in the church, to distinguish between that and the church herself, who is at once human and divine, because she is the mystical bride of Christ. the bridegroom. And so, because the church is human, yes, there is sin, there is error among the faithful, there is errors in leadership, but we trust in the infallibility of the teaching office of the church that is secured by the office of Saint Peter, the Pope, uh, teaching about matters of divine revelation through the knowledge of faith and the ethical consequences of this morality. So the church precisely in no way is the Antichrist, but the one who bears Christ into the world. The church's mother. And we can't confuse the failures of human beings in the history of the church for the church herself in her totality, in her saturating totality. And we can find just as many saints who refused the compromise between the secular and the profane as we can find billboard sinners in the history of the church. So this is where we need philosophy to make these distinctions where they need to be made and not conflate our interpretation of the church and only to its negative aspects. So a kind of argument that would accuse the church herself as being the Antichrist is probably coming out of the ideology of the left, typically, and wants to secularize the sacred through this process of intersectionality, reducing all things religious to things sociological, anthropological, psychological, political, cultural, and to flatten the church in a kind of horizontal hermeneutics versus respecting the vertical hermeneutic and the divine nature of the church. Yes, we have mentioned the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Again, that's more radical Protestant Reformation, a 20th century phenomenon in the United States, which is coming out of a radical reform movement that is biblically fundamentalist. Why worship on Saturday? Because the dots aren't being connected that, yes, the early church was worshiping on the first day of the week, and that the Sabbath for the Christians was transferred to Sunday, the day Jesus rose from the dead, what the early church fathers called the eighth day of creation. And so, yes, Seventh-day Adventism has spread around the world now, but its origin we can trace back to the 20th century alongside other movements like Christian Science and Mormonism. These kind of fundamentalist religious movements are very clear to see historically when they arise and how they're quite different than the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. In my dissertation work, which I eventually published in my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, an Etude in Phenomenology, I do a deep dive in a phenomenological analysis of Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant, Orthodox, and also the Jewish roots of Christianity, and the dialectic we observe in terms of religious expression between manifestation and proclamation. And what we have in especially Judaism and Protestant Christianity is a predilection for proclamation, for word, speech, preaching, testimony, law, Torah, and it's an ethical outgrowth of the primacy of the word. And what we have in Catholic Christianity and Orthodox Christianity is a predilection for manifestation as the primary form of religious expression, the sacramentality of the word, the presence of God among us, the sense of the sacred. And so I would invite someone to have a look at that study, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, to think more about what we see is this cleavage within the history of Christianity, especially through the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century and following, to understand why do things look a certain way, feel a certain way, sound a certain way in these Protestant denominations, and then something quite different here in the Catholic liturgy and the Orthodox liturgy. So, yeah. So I would draw your attention to that book. One more thing to say then about ideology. This relational enmity that obtains between the ideology of the left and the ideology of the right certainly seems to exploit what has become the democratization of ideas. And we experience this in the United States, in which, apart from a considerable social ascent, it is not until we have a general democratization that the rise of the lower strata allows their thinking to acquire public significance. So that's an observation of Karl Mannheim in his book, Ideology and Utopia. But we have a kind of equalizing of the playing field of ideas and democracy, and a democratization of truth, even. That truth becomes majority rule, a majority position. And so this is quite difficult for the objectivity of truth. There's good aspects of democracy, but at the same time, it leaves us culturally feeling like truth is always up for grabs based on this process of voting and electing representatives of certain ideological positions. And truth becomes an achievement of the practical goals more than what gives itself by itself ahead of action as response to the contemplation of truth. So our current experience within many democratic settings, for instance, social fragmentation, beginning with the gradual disintegration of the nuclear family in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, the technological revolution, the sexual revolution, we have a disintegration of the family, half of marriages divorcing, and so on. And what is family at this point, in a certain postmodern cultural setting? We have a great social fragmentation. And so, all the more when this happens, fragmented individuals look very passionately for places of belonging. And this they find in ideologies. They find a place to belong as if it were like a family, as if these politicians are like my mother and father. And there have been studies on these sociologically in terms of different political candidates. And when my own natural mother and father betrayed me, I looked to another one, and it can be politically oftentimes. And so my family either wears this color shirt or that color shirt. So social fragmentation has brought about an unprecedented sociopathic dilemma. And when the bases of unified collective action begin to weaken, the social structure tends to break and to produce a condition which Emile Durkheim has termed anomie, by which he means a situation which might be described as a sort of social emptiness or void. In daily living, we are met with a maelstrom of phantom publics that are unwilling to listen to the political other and readapt to new experiences. An élan politique, a political life, oftentimes seems like the only option. Thinking which is dominated by a political attitude cannot allow itself to be continuously readapted to new experiences. Structurally, political parties are public corporations and fighting organizations. This in itself already forces them into a dogmatic direction. The more intellectuals become party functionaries, the more they lost the virtue of receptivity and elasticity, which they had brought with them from their previous labil, flexible, open situation. So this is something that on this channel, The Mendicant Philosopher, I am not advocating for any political platform point of view, quite the opposite. Um, and so, as an academic, I would betray my role in the academy, in society, and moreover in the church, If I paraded as an ideologue professor, then I'm professing the ideology, I'm professing the political party, instead of, in my case, the saving passion of Jesus of Nazareth. And this is a reason Jesus said things like, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God. He said to Pontius Pilate, my kingdom is not here. And Jesus, he told people, don't tell people I'm the Messiah, I'm the Messiah, because they won't understand. They'll interpret it in a secular way. They'll want to make me king. They'll think I'm trying to lead a military coup against the Roman Empire. But he came to introduce and inaugurate the kingdom of God, which transcends earth. And whenever we confuse earth for heaven, destructive things ensue. Anytime a political program promises heaven, we should never believe that, because earth never will be the utopia of heaven. And it never was following original sin, which is our post-lapsarian condition to this day. So ideology confuses heaven for earth, or believes it can build heaven on earth sufficiently, self-sufficiently, and completely. Again, ideology is a return to the Tower of Babel, where people wanted to make their own city and make a name for themselves by building a tower that reached into the heavens. That is ideology. Whereas when God calls Abraham in just the next chapter of Genesis chapter 12, following the count of the Tower of Babel in chapter 11, Abraham, in relation to God, is the one who waits on the word of God, who goes where God says he wants Abraham to make his home. And God, who said, out of you I will make your name great and will bring a multitude of nations. It's God doing the work rather than Promethean humanity. When we let God do his work and do it best, when we let God speak best of gods, we let the fullness of theology enter, the fullness of ecclesiology enter, and here we have a great opening beyond ideology. So thank you for the comments in the chat, just trying to keep up with them. We think of the distinction between church and states. We think of the various kinds of political organization throughout human history, whether monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, anarchy. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in terms of structures of government among human beings. It was interesting, just yesterday I was driving along the highway with my son, and we passed a large prison. And right away, my heart is moved to pray for everyone detained in prison and everything that's gone on in their lives and going on in their lives right now. And then I said to my son, we started talking about the prison, and it's interesting. And the thought came to me, like, animals don't have prisons for their own kind, but we human beings have prisons. What's going on with us human beings? So as human beings, we organize ourselves, we relate to one another, we deal with things like authority and law and various structures of power. And what we do in philosophy is try to, through a hermeneutics of retrieval, but also in terms of imagination into the future of again, old and new, we think about all this in terms of timeless principles, social principles like justice, like the common good, giving one's due, and various laws that have a pedagogical function for us. So in the history of humanity, there's all kinds of different things going on in terms of government structures, in terms of the relationship between the church and the state, in which there was not such a sharp demarcation in medieval times all the time. And but again, for these reasons, where we have a kind of capitulation of the church into secular politics at different eras and different forms, it doesn't mean we dismiss the church, therefore. When there were terrible things going on in the church, is this surprising to us when the church is filled with human beings? Um, the point of the church is to wash sinners into saints over time, according to the law of gradualism. And what we find in our historical investigation of the church is a checkered history, definitely. It's the history of humanity, which God came to save by becoming human. And in Christ, there is no sin. And Christ himself indeed is the moral exemplar. As we read in the letter to the Hebrews of the New Testament, he's the leader and perfecter of our faith. Christ is this. But his church is on the way. His church is at once human and divine. It's being transfigured over the course of time. So the church is a very complex reality. And so we need a lot of different models to understand the church. And I would recommend Avery Dulles' book, Models of the Church, thinking about the church in terms of 5 different models: institution, mystical communion, sacrament, herald, and servant. And if we think of the church according to the complex mystery which she is, we won't be so dismissive of her because of the various historical contradictions that we can see in her members, even in her leadership. I hope this discourse about ideology is helpful for you to make better sense of things in the polis and in the church, in order to avoid it, in order to renounce ideology. And as far as strategies for renouncing it, I might recommend just one thing, but a second thing more so. We have to be in dialogue with the whole. We have to be in dialogue with all the issues. It's great to study the church's social doctrine. The compendium of the social doctrine of the church is a great resource to examine all the issues treated by the teaching authority of the church. It's everything. And to embrace that whole and to say, yes, I want to stand for all of these things, not just some of them and some not. No, but all of these things. And so we overcome ideology through this philosophical embrace of every question, every issue, every human striving and struggle. And this is how the bishops of the Second Vatican Council of the Church speak in the opening lines of the document Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution of the Church in the modern world. The joys and the hopes, the sorrows, the fears of humanity of our day are the joys, hopes, sorrows, and fears of this pilgrim people of God, of the church, a solidarity with all of humanity. A solidarity is very important, oriented toward the common good, and the free agency of the person, of the human person, the dignity of the person. These kind of foundational principles of Catholic social teaching are very important for us to continue to identify ideology when it happens and to constantly overcome it, again, by embracing the whole and thereby not subscribing to one ideological caste or another. So thank you again for joining me. Maybe I'll continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.